Hi, Megan. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
My first question for everybody is just to pass it back to you we'll do a summary of who you are in the post-production, but I always want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself in your own words to the listening and watching audience about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm Megan. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I have been in the mental health space for about 12 years now. I have my own private practice. And in the last year, so in 2023, I pivoted specifically to working with people who are recovering from religious harm.
Yeah, beautiful. I can't wait to unpack that with you. I'm so excited that you're here today to talk about this because this, like I said, off the record, it's my jam. And of course, everyone listening will know this is my jam.
Yeah.
Second question here is I always like to know everybody's evolution with spirituality, religion, or nothing at all. Most of us get plunked into something and then we sort of change as we evolve and grow. So whatever you want to say here about your own religious experience and where you're sort of centering yourself as an adult.
Yeah. So my professional work draws heavily from my personal experience. So I was born and raised in fundamentalist evangelical Christianity. I was homeschooled with a faith-based curriculum, and the purpose of that was to shelter us from the world and to really isolate us and to indoctrinate us with the beliefs of that specific group. So I was what you would call a true believer all through childhood, teens, and I started to, the term now is deconstruct. When I hit college, realizing for the first time after leaving that tiny little bubble, that insular community that I was in for so long, that there were other good people who had different beliefs about the Bible and Christianity than I did. And so when I recognize, hey, there's other Christians out there who have different ways of viewing things, and it wasn't the black and white thinking that I had been brought up in of our way is the only right way, everybody else is wrong, it allowed me to start having more critical thinking about what else was I taught that maybe wasn't accurate or was coercive in some way to have me kind of just buy into a specific set of beliefs. So it was really my social work degree in undergrad and then going to grad school for a social work degree as well that helped me connect in more of an empathetic way with humans and realizing that the teachings that I was brought up with, which were biblical teachings, did not align with my human values of kindness and care for other people.
Yeah, I deeply, deeply resonate with that story. Had very similar, and everyone's heard it on this podcast as of now, but like very much empathize with that. So I appreciate you telling me that. The work that you do is called religious trauma recovery. So I thought we would start there by just explaining what that is before we get into like the more nitty gritty questions.
Yeah.
Some people call this a lot of different things, but for you specifically, this is what you're calling it in your line of work and how you're helping people address religious wounding and trauma. So will you give the audience just like a quick summary of like what religious trauma recovery is?
Yes, and I actually call it religious harm recovery. And that was intentional because I see many of the elements of my own upbringing containing a component of mind control or cult mind control. And I never would have identified as somebody who was traumatized. Like I didn't recognize trauma symptoms that are pretty classic of anxiety, flashbacks, hypervigilance, nightmares. Like I didn't have any of that. But when I started to put the pieces together of the coercive control and mind control that happens in cults, I was like, bingo, that's it. That's what happened to me. And I was able to intellectualize and cognitively move through that space without having strong nervous system responses, which is what you see with religious trauma. So I decided to call it religious harm recovery to kind of widen the umbrella a little bit and to talk about some of those other components. Yes, religious trauma is one, but also the coercive control, the indoctrination, how these communities shape people's lives and behaviors and relationships and emotions, everything.
Mm-hmm. Like that's an invisible, essentially.
Yeah, that's pretty much what my work entails. It's helping people understand how these groups operate and how they take control over people's lives and their families and basically entire communities. The goal is society as a whole, honestly.
Yeah. I think coming out of my own religious experience and a very cultic religious experience was realizing that like there's a flaw in the system if you let those people leave, the bubble.
Yeah.
And and you're so unprepared. Like there were a lot of people in our community that went into what I would call, like normal society and were not prepared to deal with what was in front of them.
Yeah.
I had a question about deconstruction, deprogramming. I think this question comes up a lot, even if, like you said, even if you didn't have a cultic religious experience. There's a lot of people who've come to this show who have said, like, I'm Catholic, or I was raised in a Jewish leaning household, and like the guilt thing is just so pervasive. And I wondered how you start to address somebody's deconstruction with those thoughts, but also specifically the bifurcated thoughts, the black and white, the us is them, this, and just like the fear underneath all of that, that is supposed to be motivating to have you return to your religious group, your community. Like it's all intended to keep you sheltered in some degree. How do you even start unpacking that with somebody?
Well, I think it all starts with curiosity, because that is the first thing that these groups suppress. They shut down your critical thinking. They shut down your ability to ask questions. If you question, you're a doubting Thomas, or your faith is weak. So they start by disconnecting you from just critical thinking, curiosity, those things that are innately within us generally.
Yeah.
So when somebody is starting to leave the control or to step away from the control or the rigidity, it's all about inspiring that curiosity again, to ask those questions, to maybe educate themselves in ways that they didn't have access to before or that they were prohibited from. A lot of religious groups have their own literature. I mean, with evangelical Christianity, there's entire media institutions. You have your contemporary Christian music, and you have your videos that you're allowed to watch. You have your even fiction books and nonfiction books. Like you have the publishers that are approved. So it's even just encouraging people to go explore those things that were prohibited. Listen to the music you weren't allowed to listen to, read the books you weren't allowed to read. I mean, I think reading Harry Potter has been a rite of passage for so many evangelicals in particular, because that was considered magic and evil. And so witchcraft. So especially for millennials, that was, shut down. And this isn't a promotion of Harry Potter, but it's just, I think, to be able to do what was prohibited for so long is very empowering for people. So I say that that's kind of step one, is get that curiosity back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's spot on. I completely agree that that's exactly what happens in a lot of these experiences, that suppression of curiosity and critical thinking. And I think when you layer that on, and I'm sure you'll have something to say about this, when you layer on the authoritarian component of it, like you get worn down. And most of us are coming into this experience as children, so we already have like the psychological blueprint of like we need to obey our parents, and they're telling us to obey these church elders. So wherever you keep trying to like question, and it keeps getting pushed down and pushed down. And so like for you, thinking about adding the authoritarian component on top of, like, if you are trying to be curious, where do you see that sabotaging somebody's critical thinking early on?
Yeah, so the folks I tend to connect with most are those who were raised in it like I was. And I talk a lot about the intersection of the control in the family and the control of the religious community. And it is this trickle down effect, and it's intentional that these groups kind of hijack the family system and infiltrate the family system and want to preserve family values. And they put parents then in charge of the indoctrination process of the children. And so it comes from the top down. So you have an authoritarian God, at least with my religion, you did, and down through the church leaders, down to the family system. And then the family system is also very hierarchical, typically with it's a 2-parent household, a heterosexual marriage. The dad is the leader, the mom is the helper, and then the children are submissive underneath. And the parenting that's often reflected in those families is either authoritarian parenting, where you have those rigid rules, you tend to have harsh discipline, you're not allowed to question, that suppression of curiosity and autonomy and individuality, that's all under that authoritarianism. And or you have emotionally neglectful parents in these systems who outsource the parenting and the emotional connection to either God or religious figures or religious literature of, oh, you're worried about something. Okay, well, you need to pray to God about that. And so it starts, I know you asked how the curiosity is suppressed, but it's all of those elements of things that create safety and connection for children is not there. You know, there's not emotional support, and there is active suppression of autonomy and individuality. And these are the rules. We need to eradicate the sin within you that you're born with. So this idea of original sin, which I know not all religious groups believe in original sin in the same way that the evangelicals do, but most groups have some version of that where you're somehow bad, flawed, and you need saved from something.
I do have that as a question, so we'll dive into that one as well.
Okay. Yeah. So that's how the parents kind of are put in the role of the indoctrinators for the religious institution, because they're really trying to save and protect their children from some sort of eternal consequence.
Yeah, it's so complicated and manipulative and also so well organized. And I always wonder, like way back in the day when they were trying to decide, I'm just speaking for Abrahamic religion and how they decided they were going to parse it out. And when Constantine was trying to get the Bible together, and like, I don't know that they really thought all of these byproducts of indoctrination and control would be, I think, this strongly held inside this experience. I think they probably had an idea because they were trying to unite people, but like probably looking downward through history, I can't imagine they would be able to formulate in this way, which seems so odd to me. That it's become this thing, and it has just become such a mechanism of control and suppression and all of those things. In the vein of the sinfulness thing, for me, that was one of the root causes I had to deconstruct in myself and also really address, because there was this like constant tether to unworthiness that kept coming back to my religious experience, and this idea of being a bad person. And I would always think, even as a child or a young adolescent, like, I don't feel bad. Like, I don't feel like I'm a bad person, but the church is telling me I'm a bad person, and I've got to go to confession, and I got to go tell this guy what I did. And I'd have to I'd be there and I'd be like, what am I going to say to him that like I didn't get up for my alarm fast enough? And then that's considered lazy. And like, what is idleness is like the hands of the devil.
Yes.
You're just like nitpicking. You're becoming hypercritical of yourself against the sinfulness. Anyways, long story short, but the inherent sinfulness that we are indoctrinated, if you come into contact with religion this way, where are you starting with people? Because it's so tied to their worthiness. Like, how do you even start addressing this with them to try to change their view about themselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think this is the one that people do struggle with the most. I mean, there are a few top contenders for the most there, but this is one of them.
What are the other top contenders in your mind's eye?
The purity culture.
Yeah.
And that's kind of interwoven with
huge.
that too. But just being disconnected from your body, or seeing your body as a stumbling block, something that's going to bring other people down, something that shouldn't experience pleasure. It's different between men and women, but both men and women experience the adverse effects of purity culture, which I don't think is talked about enough. It's something I try to talk about, but men really suffer too. even though in these systems it seems like men are given power,
Right.
they do suffer as well, and especially in the purity culture space. So yeah, the original sin, purity culture, and then I would say just how to form healthy relationships with others,
Yeah.
because everything is so transactional in these groups, and the only criteria for really forming a friendship or a relationship with somebody is that you share the same beliefs. So you're not
Yes.
really getting to know anybody's interests, values, personality. Any other criteria doesn't matter. So when people get out of these systems, they're like, how do I connect with others? How do I like make friends? What do I
There's a
base
lot
a
of
relationship on?
awkwardness. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are others, but I think those are the ones
The
I
top three.
tend to see quite a bit. So, in terms of where do you even begin to address that worthiness, that original sin, that I'm bad inside? I use something called parts work in my therapy.
Oh, I
It's
love parts work.
internal family systems. Yes. So I love it because the entire premise of that model is that we have an authentic self that
Mm-hmm.
is good. It's the idea that we are good inside, and all of the other aspects of how we show up in the world, whether it's shame or frustration or anger, anxiety, these are generally parts that developed in response to the stressors that we were up against in our family of origin and in these toxic religious systems. So when we can go into a parts work session and get to know the part that's presenting as maybe unworthiness, then we can actually have that part step aside and begin to see who is authentically there and
Mm-hmm.
what does that feel like. So that's for the beginning.
Yeah, that's really good. Yes, IFS and parts work, I think, really saves a lot of people because you
Yeah.
can take an objective view. I think it's interesting to think about if we break the genders up into two places, the men and women, and how it's affecting us both. And the purity culture thing, for sure, what you talked about, the embodiment issue, and also just feeling like your body is something sinful. So and that like you're constantly told that your body may make men lust. And it's like your body is a weapon. It's like so bizarre.
Yeah.
And being able to like do that parts work where you can come out a degree and sort of look at yourself with like really compassionate and kindness and objectivity, I think is just so, so very important.
Yeah.
I wanted to also know, like, you do talk a lot about the patriarchy and religion, and I'm constantly beating this down to everybody because you cannot separate these two, especially not in Western society. They are, unfortunately, to me, in my mind's eye, one and the same. And
Yeah.
even if you don't have a religious experience, the patriarchal view of like how people should conform, it infiltrates a lot of places, and it's all in the guise, or it's all kind of built on partly a lot of religious ideas, but you do talk about like how this affects men. I wondered if we could just talk about in your point of view, how do you see patriarchy and religion intersecting and also affecting people? And then any tips and tricks you have about trying to navigate that if you start to notice that for yourself in this healing process.
Yeah. So, I mean, you already touched on this, but I think we live in a patriarchal culture, number one. And then number two, these authoritarian religious groups are patriarchal in nature. So they're based on the idea that the male gender is just inherently superior on some level, even if
Right.
they don't come right out and say that. It's casting men as leaders and women as helpers. You're automatically saying they're a notch above. And so you see the hierarchy that flows down from that. So, in terms of how they intersect, I think that patriarchy is interwoven in our culture, and then it has really effectively used many religions as a tool to achieve its goal, which
Yeah.
is to empower the heterosexual white men, typically.
Mm-hmm.
But it does harm all people. You know, even though it casts men in these positions of power, not all men benefit from being in that position of power, because there's tremendous pressure that is imposed upon men, especially in the religious groups, where they're expected to lead their families in a very specific way, usually being the financial breadwinner, being ultimately responsible for how their family is presenting in the community. And so, for example, in my church, one that I grew up in, I was in several, but this was in my teenage years, so it feels more significant. There was an elder who had a son who was smoking and drinking and doing very normal teenage behaviors, but he was sort of brought under the spotlight by the religious community because he didn't have his family in order. And so he was being personally judged by the entire community based on the behavior of his teenage son, who was, again, engaging in developmentally appropriate adolescent behavior.
I hate that calling out and policing element of it drove me bonkers.
Yeah. And the other big thing is that I see with men is that they're very disconnected from their emotions. Men are not supposed to have emotions in these communities. Depending on which community you're in, women aren't really supposed to either, because you're supposed to turn everything over to God. But men in particular are supposed to be kind of stoic and the strong one of the family that everybody leans on. And so they're not supposed to or allowed to show any kind of vulnerabilities. So they're very, emotions, I feel even more so for men, are really suppressed. And, how all people suffer. I mean, I think we probably have a pretty good idea of how women are affected, but also I really want to call out the unique impact of sexual minorities. I mean, we talk about men and women, but sexual minorities don't even get to exist in this culture. Yeah. And how painful and traumatizing that is to grow up in a community that completely erases your identity and or is hateful towards you for it or casts you out.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can take this into two parts, because and in alignment with like the purity culture, because I think so we can talk about, or three parts, I suppose. We can talk about men, and we can talk about women, and then we can talk about everybody else who identifies as LGBTQIA. But let's start with the women, since that's what we know probably the best, because we're both women. In most Christian religions, there's the Trinity. But there was no representation of a woman there. There's so much indirect messaging and propaganda that says women are not welcome, women don't belong here. Again, even if they don't say it outright. And then you add the purity element of like the virginal lifestyle and purity, and just that suppression was so fucked up. Like, we don't have time to go into that, but like when we think about just the indirect and the direct messaging to women about where we even fit into the concept of religion, it's so messed up. And how do you find yourself in that religious experience if all you're supposed to be is like not even like a side character? You're like less than a side character. I don't know what you want to say here about that, but I'm just curious what that experience was like for you, and how you're helping women sort of unpack this for themselves.
Yeah. And it's so varied for different women too, depending on the religious community itself. But I think across the board, as you said, like if you're using the Bible, I mean, it's all he, him pronouns for the God figures, the Trinity, as you said. And it is, all of the scripture is very much oriented towards male domination.
Yeah.
The churches that I was a part of did not allow women into leadership positions. One of the most impactful memories I had, and this is the same church I was referencing before where the deacon was kind of put under the spotlight, but the pastor's wife was a Sunday school teacher. And I was in the 5th and 6th grade class. And in that class, I remember her saying, well, this is the highest grade I will teach, because once boys get into 7th grade, they're too close to becoming men, and I can't teach men. I can't be an authority over men.
Wow.
And that would be a 13-year-old boy. So this 40-year-old woman did not feel that she had the blessing from God or the ability to educate a 13-year-old male about spiritual matters. So that was the messaging, in the communities I grew up in. And I think that from, telling women the attributes of being gentle, meek, quiet, submissive, obedient, all of these characteristics, whereas men are sort of championed to be, again, the leaders and the spokesperson for the family, and all of these, hyper masculine characteristics. I think that is what is glorified in these communities.
Yeah, it's so wild to me. It's also interesting, like pivoting towards the men, is I think what I've seen out of my religious experience, like looking out, from the outside in, is also how much privilege it gives men. I often talk about how, if you grow up in a religious community that has a patriarchal view, which most of them do here in Western religion, like every male kid already has a head start on his life. Like he's already supported over a woman. Like he's given so much more grace. He's given so much more opportunity to do anything. And there's like so much privilege. And and I'm not just talking about white privilege. I'm talking about religious privilege from the male perspective, and how much that can catapult. I think we see this a lot, like even in the Mormon religion, like they're very focused on putting the men at the head of the household. And there's, we'll never find a poor Mormon, because they're hyper focused on the financial stability of the family. And so they're constantly pushing those men forward into positions. But talking about the men, and then we'll get to the third category here. What are I don't know if there's top 3 things that you, aside from purity culture, that you want to talk about, that where they are directly affected, and what you can do about that in the work that you do.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I have a specific top 3 off the top of my head. I think that emotional suppression piece is a huge one. Helping men to access feelings is hugely important in healing and reconnecting with their authentic selves too, because men have just as many emotions as women do, right?
Yeah.
And another thing I hear from men, or I've heard from men in the community, or the community I have online, is what you were referencing with the Mormons of, kind of pushing forward these positions where they're going to be financially secure and the breadwinners for the family and all of that. But men are not given the opportunity to pursue the things that they may actually want to pursue, because it's not the most financially stable, or it's not considered a masculine role. So they're missing out on pursuing things that are really aligned with their interest, desires, and what they would really be drawn to naturally.
Like nothing creativity or artistic. You're not going to see that, and definitely not in that perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even being pushed into positions of ministry, that's a big one. I've seen too, if they are not going into something that's really going to be financially successful, then they're really pushed towards ministry positions, for example. Whereas women are not pushed towards ministry typically. Women do, but it's not an expectation in the way that it may be for men.
Yeah, and there's no failure there. It's just success, which is wild to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thinking about the third bucket here, which is all of our beautiful friends that listen to the pod, which are the LGBTQIA members of our community. For me, this was a big one in my religious experience. I always questioned what was the deal. Like, why were we so upset about people who presented as homosexual or with anywhere on the gender binary. Like, it was just so confusing to me. But specifically in my experience, I don't think I've talked about this before, but when I was a teenager in my religious experience, there was one girl in our community that knew for sure she was gay, and she was immediately pushed out. Like, we never saw her. Her family abandoned her. Like, she was just gone. I still don't know to this day what happened to her. And I remember thinking about the cruelness of that, like how cruel it was and how confusing it was. And then when I left my religion of origin, that severing that happens, which we can talk about later, because most of us, our religious community, if we grew up like this, our religious community is our friends, our family, like our therapy, like it's everything, right? So you're severing that tie and you have nothing. And I remember thinking at some point, now I really understand what happens to people who are gay and come out of this experience, not because I want to like resonate with who they are as gay, but because I understood I was immediately out and I didn't have any support and nobody understood me. And mostly they thought I was like a terrible demonic person who had like, whatever, become too liberal or whatever. And also a lot of gay people want to have a relationship with Jesus too, right? Like there's so many of them who want to maintain that relationship, and trying to find a space for them where they can cultivate their Christianity is just like, I feel so much for these people. So I'm just going to pass it back to you about anything you want to say about this specific group and how we can help them.
Yeah. Well, this is a tough one for me, and I don't put a lot of content out specifically related to this population because I am a heterosexual cisgender woman, and I know I can't personally relate or speak to the experience. Anything I say here, I'm trying to say, from that framework of I don't personally know what this is like. One of the things that I've noticed happens quite often, it seems more so for women, and I'm not quite sure why that is, but deconstructing faith and deprogramming has led to deconstructing sexuality and many women realizing that I'm not straight, actually. And I could very happily pursue a relationship with a woman, except I married a man 15 years ago, and now I'll never know or get to explore that. And so, working with women who are in these heterosexual, what I would call purity culture marriages, because they got married while they were still within that framework, have a lot to grieve about the opportunity that they missed to actually explore their sexuality. So I think that is where I see a lot of my work actually is the people who follow the plan, follow what they were indoctrinated to do, maybe didn't have sex at all before they got married, didn't understand their own sexuality or totally suppressed it because that's what you were supposed to do. And then got into these marriages. And then once the religious control started to fall away and they started to heal and recover, that's when their sexuality opened up. And now it's like a discovering of themselves. So that's one piece of it, is sort of this discovery and this grief that comes with that and how to handle that, because everybody chooses to handle it maybe a little bit differently. But then it's the people like your friend who knew, like she knew and was, it sounds like, open about it, and then was suppressed and disregarded and cast out. And I just, you think you and I have shame. I mean, I can't even imagine.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah, being completely cut off and disregarded for who you are as an adolescent when you're still developing and figuring yourself out on top of it. So, it's a lot. That is traumatic. That is a huge relational trauma. So there's grief work, there's relational trauma work, there's all of these pieces. But you talk about that authentic self that's at our core, these folks have had that part of them so cut off. Like, you cannot be that and be part of this community. And it's just it's hateful and it's awful.
It's so awful. Yeah. This happens not just in the sexual experience, but because of the religious indoctrination and the disembodiment. Like there's so much disassociation that happens to us, right? And I think you're right. I've seen a lot of women more than men, but I think it's also because, again, men, even if you leave the religious experience, you're still stuck under the patriarchal, what is it called? Like framework is, I think, is what you keep using.
Yeah.
And yes, you're still stuck under that. So they're not really ever free either. But if women leave the religious, setting, I do see them taking that route as well. I had to take that route as well. I had to figure out like why didn't I have urges, and then also embody my body for pleasure. That whole experience is just so disorienting, and I love to witness women take that journey for themselves because it's so beautiful and it's so healing and it's so necessary. And just like I feel like it's like an act of just like a huge act of defiance and liberation to come back into your body in any way possible, but definitely through sexual discovery is such a beautiful, beautiful thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think as women are exploring their sexuality too, and some of the difference there, I think what you're touching on is all the internalized homophobia, which persists outside of the religious communities in our patriarchal culture. I think it's very much, and that affects women too, of course, but it seems the toxicity seems to be especially potent with men. Yes. Unfortunately, we have the toxic masculinity and everything else. So I think even outside of the religious communities, men still don't feel that they have the safety to fully explore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're spot on. I'm mindful of the time and I want to get to some more things that you're really an expert on here. But I wanted to talk to you about spiritual abuse, manipulation, and narcissism, which are three different things, but I feel like they overlap each other. And I think when you are in a religious experience, again, even if it's not cultic, there is all those things. There is the manipulation aspect, and there's the narcissism, and then there's abuse. And when we think about abuse, I don't think it's just necessarily physical, financial. It's like mental and controlling and all of those things. Let's say somebody is kind of getting their pointers up about maybe this isn't the right place for me to be long term. How would they identify those three things and maybe start to question those?
So I think that the way they're connected, I think you said spiritual abuse, manipulation, and narcissism.
Yes.
Are those the three you said?
Yes.
So I think that they are all connected. I think spiritual abuse is a form of narcissistic control in action. And I think manipulation is a form of coercive control, which is a tool of the narcissism. So they are all interwoven and distinct in a way as well. But, so if somebody's sort of like, ooh, I'm not sure about this community, whether it's a church or a workplace or, a group, I think it's whenever you start to notice that there is suppression of autonomy, there is suppression of critical thinking, there is a black and white rigid framework that's applied for how you're to do things. And there's this component of us versus them. So you have the in-group and the out-group. Mm-hmm. So I think those are the biggest red flags.
Yeah.
And that's what I see. You have these very insular communities that are developing. And I think what throws people off a little bit is sometimes we talk about these big religious communities like Catholicism or Mormonism or evangelical Christianity. And yes, there's a spectrum of control, I think, in any of those larger groups. But I think when you start to get down to the smaller groups, like look at your home church or the community you're in, what elements of it becoming an insular community can you detect? I mean, that's where I get into talking about cults and cult mind control and all of that. And so it's all based on this layer of coercive control. It's built on a foundation of coercive control.
Yeah, and I think the reason why I wanted to talk about this as well is because a lot of the people that are listening to this podcast and watching with us right now, they've left their religion of origin and they're looking for another place to land. But also they have found, because they've written in and I've talked about it, I've witnessed it. I myself have not rejoined any spiritual community. I don't think I ever will, because I started to notice, and I tried everything, like I went through the gamut, Hinduism, Buddhism, like I landed as a Buddhist in thought, but not, I won't join a community.
Yeah.
But because I noticed those red flags as well, they still existed in these spiritual communities who were saying like, you don't need the dogma, you don't need Jesus or whatever, but those control mechanisms, the indoctrination, the isolation, those still existed. And I was like, I'm not going there. But I noticed from people who didn't grow up in high control, high religion, who've come and talked to me, like they didn't have a mechanism inside themselves to detect that behavior because they weren't exposed to it in their religious experience or non-religious experience. So it's like so interesting that we really need to take like a very objective view of any kind of community we're getting into, because all of those things can exist no matter what religion, spirituality it is.
Oh, that's so true. I mean, you see it with different new age groups. You'll see it with yoga groups. You'll see it with atheists even, So it's any group that tells you they have the right way. Their way is the right way. And I've had people ask, like, how can I sort of assess a church before I even go into it? Which I'm same as you. I don't think I'll ever be able to really join a formal religious or spiritual community again either. And I've tested out a few myself as well. But I say go onto the website and read the section that says their doctrine or their beliefs or their, like, they'll call it different things, but there's usually a section that outlines like what we believe. Core tenets of our beliefs or whatever.
Who's in and who's out.
Who's in and who's out. And so if there's a very rigid structure to that where there's no curiosity or openness, run. Right. But if you get onto the website, I was recently on a Unitarian church website and it says, we are welcome and affirming of all people. We don't think that we have the answer. We are curious and we are exploring. I'm not quoting what this website said, but those were the elements of what it was saying, like that we are a questioning group. Like we are here for inquiry, and that we are not using like one doctrine or one set of rules or one set of criteria to figure out, who's in and who's out.
Yeah. Run. Red flag. Move on. Okay, so I wanted to ask you about spiritual bypass. I didn't know this term until I came into the world of spirituality, and everyone was like, spiritual bypass. But it happened in my religious experience. And I wish I had had that term just to throw it in people's faces. Would have been nice back then. When we think about spiritual bypass, to me, I feel like in religious experience, in spiritual communities, at the yoga studio, like there's so much intrinsic harm that happens with bypass. I think it's a byproduct of our human experience right now, where we are so dissociative in everything we do. That doesn't have anything to do with religion. And it's like no one wants to feel anything. No one wants to access like the totality of their humanity. Where are you on this topic?
Yeah, and you're so right. It is woven into many parts of life, even outside of a formal religion. But in a formal religion, how you see it showing up is taking things to an external source for some sort of comfort or to escape. It's kind of like an escapism, to escape the pain of the situation or to not have to feel your feelings around it. And in a lot of these toxic religious groups, certain emotions aren't even allowed. So you bypass through prayer and through sort of this outsourcing to this external deity. But yeah, you also see it where you have a parent who has a child that's distraught about something and they say, oh, don't cry. It's okay. Don't cry. And that's a form of bypassing too, because you're not allowing that child to actually have their emotions. And so these children learn very early on, okay, we don't cry or we don't show sadness. Or say a child is upset about something and maybe they're upset with their parent and they raise their voice and the parent goes, don't you raise your voice at me, you lower your voice. I mean, that kind of thing is all suppressing your body's natural, like whether it's tears or an elevated tone. Not that I'm saying people should go around yelling at each other,
but our natural responses.
But we're learning to disconnect from our natural responses and what emotions are appropriate or not appropriate. So those are two examples that can exist outside of religion. And then you also have the toxic positivity.
Yeah.
You know, only think good thoughts, positive vibes only. We're not allowing negativity in this space, that kind of thing. The law of attraction is another one that can become very risky too, because that's like, well, you create your reality. And I'm not going to go down that path to say whether that's true or not true. But when you believe that everything in your world is a direct byproduct of a thought that you've had, that is definitely leads to bypassing as well, because now you can only allow yourself to ever think positive things, or something terrible you're gonna manifest something terrible in your life.
Right. And that becomes like an energy resource suck for your mind and for your body.
Yeah. So it's sort of the opposite of feeling your feelings and being present with the experience and sensation in your body and what your nervous system is doing.
Yeah. I have one big question for you here at the end of the interview. I want to talk to you about someone like me, someone like anybody who's listened to this podcast, is when you leave your religious experience, your family doesn't want to come along with you for that.
Yeah.
That's such a painful experience to have to endure. I had to endure it. I'm on better terms with my family now, but there is definitely sort of like a very clear line between like what we can talk about and what we can't talk about, right? Like there's a distinct division there. But I'm imagining you talk to a lot of people where their family is not supportive of them choosing something different. And so I want to speak to those people who are in the middle of that process and tell them anything encouraging to continue their path back to their authentic self. Because I think when we leave our religious experience, that calling comes in from inside of us. It's asking us to return to ourselves. That's definitely true for me. It's true for a lot of people who've come here. Yeah. So how do we encourage them, even though it's tough and it's hard? And I've heard horror stories from a lot of people's family. How do we encourage those people to just stay the path on this?
Yeah. Well, and I'm one of those people too, so I can really relate to the pain that's wrapped up in that. In terms of staying the course, and this is so real because I've had people say, I almost just want to go back to church and fake it because it's too hard to be cut off from everyone and everything that I've known my whole life. And if that's what people need to do, I would never tell somebody not to do that, but it is going to be a continued divorcing from your authentic self should you make that choice. So I encourage people to try to really evaluate where their family members are at in terms of receptivity and abusiveness, because some families become very toxic and abusive. Other families are just extremely avoidant. So some families are really happy to just pretend that they don't know that you're going to hell and have, Thanksgiving dinner together. Some families really are okay with that. And so you can sort of determine what those safe topics are and are not, and just know, like, we just don't go venturing into certain areas. But then to care for yourself, you need to have spaces where you can have your authentic self in connection and in relationships with others, whether it's friendships or a romantic partnership or other community spaces. And that's essential. So you do have to have a space for your authentic self to be able to shine, but it is grieving the fact that your family of origin is no longer that space. So, and others, have to choose estrangement because their family is abusive and they are toxic and they won't stop trying to reconvert you. And so you have to put those boundaries in place in order to preserve your own emotional well-being. So
Mm-hmm.
I try not to specifically advise people because
It's a case by case kind of situation.
and it's a whole spectrum, but you have to kind of assess your family because you know them best, assess their level of abusiveness or safety, and then figure out like the depth that you can go, and then where it becomes unsafe if you go past a certain point.
Yeah, it's super scary, and I think like I learned, I didn't realize when I broke from my religious experience, because I also got divorced at the same time, like in hindsight what I would have done was gotten divorced first and then told my family I was leaving my religion of origin, because it was almost too much for them to ingest both of those things at the same time. And when you were talking back there about when we talked about like the policing and the pastor being called out for his son, I think what happens too when people decide to leave, because there's so much pressure from the religious institution to keep the family intact, there's also like your parents take your choice so personal, and they take it as an affront to them, and also that they have failed in some regard.
Yeah.
And then that creates like a whole different level of trauma that is about them, but they're trying to blame it on you. And like it's just so complicated, and it's so nuanced, and it's so painful. And my mom has said to me, "You don't feel like I can die because I think you're going to go to hell." And I'm like, wow, that's wild, but you can die if you need to. You know, like you don't need to hang on.
Yeah. And I can, really empathize with what you're saying there too. And I, for a long time, said, I could never tell my mom where I'm really at with my religious beliefs because she would carry that fear that I was going to burn in hell forever.
Yeah.
And that is the case for a lot of people. And so, it's not that these parents are necessarily trying to be manipulative and controlling, because they're so indoctrinated. They are fearful that you are going to be tortured forever.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
It's horrible.
Yeah. I always said when I left my religious experience and I would say to a like moderately healed place, is that the amount of like mental energy I spent on thinking about my soul was just gone. And I remember just like there was this constant like tape that was playing. Like if I died today, would I be able to go to hell? Like I'm sorry, to heaven. It's a Freudian slip there. But if I died today, like could I honestly say I'm going to go to heaven? Because that was the constant question. Like, are you living good enough to like die and then go directly to heaven? And thinking about that constantly, like the mental load of that on a person is so stifling. And like when we shouldn't have to think about that. And I have such a different, we don't have time for it now, but I have such a different view of perspective about what happens to us after we die now, and have no fear around it too, because the mental load of the fear associated with that thought of like heaven or hell is just like, it's exhausting.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. And I find it really amusing because I have a lot of people, and I'm one of them, who say like, I wasn't afraid that I wouldn't go to heaven. I almost had heaven anxiety because that sounded terribly boring. I just didn't want to go to hell. So, how do I stay out of hell becomes a very preoccupying thought for a lot of people. And I don't know, do Catholics have the rapture fear?
Yeah, there's rapture, and then there's also like, because they put the element of purgatory, so it's like you don't like, there's still another form of punishment before you can get to heaven. It's like, oh cool, I suffered my entire life, and then I'm gonna die, and then I'm gonna suffer in like some segment of hell before I can get to heaven. Like that sounds super cool.
Yeah. So all of those tactics, it's called phobia indoctrination. So it's whether it's purgatory, hell, the rapture, all of these things that do become very preoccupying, and people develop, OCD, or religious scrupulosity is another term for it, around those fears. I love that term. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it's real. And that's the trauma piece right there.
Yeah. So where do you see, just last question here before we wrap up. I know I said my last one was, but I had this one for a question. I really do want to get your thoughts on this, but like, since you're doing this work with trying to get a lot of people healed in their religious experience, like, and for me, I've seen people, like, predominantly everyone who listens, I've had 3 people on this podcast in 7 years that started in a religion and stayed in it. Now they were open to other things, and that's why they showed up here. But like, most everyone that is a part of this community or have come onto this podcast, they are not in their religion of origin. And I think because as humanity, we're not meant to stay stagnant. And a lot of about religion is about stagnating and not changing and rejecting evolution.
Yeah.
For you, where do you see religion going long term? Like, what are your thoughts on that? And what do you see as us evolving as in our shared humanity towards?
That is a really big question. So where do I see us going, and where would I like us to go? Or two separate
both.
questions.
Two different questions there. Yeah, both.
I mean, what I would like to see is that people begin to connect with, or continue to connect with, not have their curiosity suppressed to begin with, to be able to become more interconnected without doctrine. I don't think doctrine really serves us. I think it divides us. Where do I see us going, especially in light of our current political climate that has completely intertwined politics, religion, and power? I don't see it going in a good direction. I see it becoming more rigid and divisive and extreme. That being said, there have been waves of millennials and Gen Z who've been leaving the church because of the political stuff. So I think there's always going to be these pockets of extremism for sure. But I do hope that as we continue to evolve mentally, emotionally, developmentally, just as a human species, that the majority will become more interconnected without dogma, without doctrine.
Yeah, that's my hope too. And also that we remember our shared humanity, because we didn't touch on this, but a lot about the religious experience is about othering each other, which I'm a huge like opposer of. And I think like that's at the root of so much negativity in a religious experience, even in a spiritual experience, where we forget our shared humanity and we start to classify and declassify humans and dehumanize them is just such a gross and disgusting way to live as a society and as a species. And I hate that for where our current place of where we are. Okay, so we're going to wrap up. I'm going to give you some space to tell everybody, where they can find you on social media, what you have going on, like how can they connect with you if they want to work with you, all the things.
Yeah. So I am basically religious harm recovery pretty much everywhere. So that's my website, religiousharmrecovery.com. That's my hand on Instagram. That is my private Facebook group, which I would encourage people to connect with because it is a really active and supportive community that I manage and try to keep it from being spammy or scammy or weird or all of that stuff.
All the things.
All the things. And then if people can join my newsletter, I send it out every week and it's a topical educational email about something related to religious harm recovery. So I have different topics, kind of that broad categories I cycle between, but they're always meant to be educational and informative. So joining my email list is a great way to stay connected to me.
Yeah, wonderful. And I always wrap up with some gratitude with my guest. I always want to check in with them about what 3 things they're grateful for this week, this month, this year, anything that's rolling around in your heart center.
Yeah. Well, I love the fall season. So I'm an October baby, so I love October. So I just feel grateful when I see the beauty of the fall leaves. I live in Pennsylvania, so we have really beautiful fall. And that coziness of kind of sliding into the winter season as everything gets darker a little earlier. I'm very grateful for my spouse, Michael. I'm recently remarried, so I had a purity culture marriage, and then now I'm remarried. We were recently married, and he's so supportive of this work and has really encouraged me to pursue this and is always a great sounding board. And I would have to say also my 2 little fur biscuits, one of whom just tried to jump on my desk here. I don't know if you saw a tail go by or not. So that was Zeldis.
It happens a lot on here.
So I have Zelda and Fitzgerald in there. My Theracats, they will try to join me for sessions, and you'll hear them and see them in the background a lot too. So yeah, those
They're
are three
bringing
things.
something. They're bringing some healing modality to the session. I have no doubt.
Well, they keep me calm and grounded during the session. So if nothing else, they're benefiting the session that way.
Oh, well, I loved meeting you, Megan. I love what you're doing. I think it's so necessary. I think we need another place to sort of unpack this really important work. And I love that you're doing it. I love that you have such a strong professional background. We didn't even get into all of that, but we'll summarize in the post-production about your credentials and everything. But I'm really grateful that you're doing this work because I think it's really necessary. And as people step away from their religion, they need somebody to unpack this with who doesn't just understand from a therapeutic standpoint, but from a resonance standpoint too.
Yeah.
So you doing that, I think is so critical. And I just, like to take from the religious experience, I do feel like you're doing God's work.
Yeah. The irony of this all,
yes.
right? Thank
Exactly.
you. Thank you so much for saying all that. I appreciate that. And I feel that I am doing what I was called to do.
Hey, you ended up doing it. It may not look like how they wanted, but man, you're doing the literal most. So I appreciate you. And I hope that all the right people find you so that we can heal the world from this crazy religious indoctrination wildness.
Yes. And I appreciate the work you're doing with having this podcast and giving a platform for people to share their stories as well. So thank you.
This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Krista Ziomata, in alignment with Light Casting. Music curated and created by Mr. Pixie. You can find I'm Awake Now What on all social media channels by searching IANW Podcast. Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, download, rate, and review. Come back every Sunday to partake in a new and enlightening conversation. May you be filled with love and light until we meet again.